Okay, Dr. Lisa Firestone, what is an emotional trigger and why is it important to understand them?
Okay. Emotional triggers are where something in the current day, whatever it might be, triggers in us a feeling that's really about the past and some unresolved trauma. So triggers are set up by unresolved trauma. And by trauma, I don't mean necessarily it has to be big T trauma, what we usually think of as trauma. It doesn't have to be
Yeah.
physical abuse or sexual abuse or something major. It has to be something that changed how we saw ourselves, other people in the world. And lots of things can act as triggers. So you could walk into the wallpaper of a room and it's the same as the wallpaper in the room you were beaten in as a child. You're going to have a very awful feeling. You're not going to think, oh, I recognize that wallpaper. You're having an implicit memory of the wallpaper and it's triggering an old feeling, which is, I got to get out of here. We can also have implicit memories that don't feel like we're remembering for feelings. So we get into an argument with somebody that we care about, especially our spouse or our significant other. That may trigger feelings like we're going to get rejected that are feelings, the same feeling we had when we were a little kid about getting rejected, where we really needed our parents, as opposed to the feeling we'd have about what's going on currently, which still might be strong, but it wouldn't be as strong or as desperate or feel life-threatening, because it isn't anymore. People can walk away from us and we're still probably going to survive.
Got it. Yeah. Okay. So it seems like the main idea here is that when you go through something in the current moment, it kind of like triggers something from the past, and oftentimes that's trauma that has not been resolved, right? So, and then obviously, I guess in your definition, you're kind of saying that trauma is not necessarily the extremes as kind of, we all talk about. It's just something that changed your self perception for the negative, right? Would you say that's accurate?
Right, right. And you internalize something like, I'm not worthwhile, or people are going to leave me, or whatever it might be.
Got it. Okay. Now, when it comes down to the most common types of emotions that people experience when going through a trigger, what would those most common emotions be? Like, is it anger or jealousy, sadness? Like, what are the most common types of emotions that you've seen? Just so people are kind of aware.
Yeah. The most common ones I see are either anxiety, like a lot of, overwhelming fear, anxiety, or a lot of sadness or pain, you know.
Um, Dr. Firestone, sorry to interrupt you, but I can hear a lawnmower in the background.
Yeah, let me see if I can get them to stop.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you. I'm sorry about that.
No, that was loud, eh? I
Oh
can
my
barely
God,
hear
a
it.
leaf blower. What timing?
Yeah. Okay, so your video's choppy, but I think it should be fine after, the post edit. So it's fine.
Okay.
Like you can carry on with what you were saying. Sadness,
Just
anxiety.
like sadness, anxiety, those are the most common ones I see. Emotional pain from the past. And sometimes really like big feelings that are out of proportion to what you would feel as an adult, even if this thing was happening to you. They're the feelings that a young child would have if this was happening. So, if a person walks away from you as a baby, you could actually not survive. But if somebody walks away from you as an adult, you can survive. It may feel really bad, but you can survive it. It's different. So there's an intensity to the feelings. It could be, it triggers some emotional feeling. If you can find out what that feeling is for you that gets triggered in those moments, you can then recognize that often that's that same feeling getting triggered in other situations that sets you off. So that's an important way you can start to have some control over it. Because if you can name it, what the
Mm-hmm.
experience is, and the more you can do that use a word that's very detailed, not just bad, but like, oh, that makes me feel shame. There might even be an image with it, like of getting, slapped on the nose or, put down in
Yeah.
some way. If you can do that, then it's like, oh, it's just that again. And it takes a lot of the feeling out of it. So that's one of the reasons it's important to recognize our triggers, is because when we have unresolved trauma, it intrudes on us. It comes up at times unexpectedly. It can be overwhelming. And we can feel re-victimized in a way, or re-experiencing the trauma, and it's not under our control. If we start to identify it and name it and write about it and know what it is, then we're deciding to recall it when we feel like we're writing about it. We're starting to resolve some of the unresolved parts of it and make sense of it. And that makes us feel in control. And then it's not controlling us. And
Yeah.
it also resolves it to some extent, so we're less likely to get triggered in the future. Or even if we do, we're not going to get overwhelmed by it and, floored by it.
Exactly. Yeah. So we will take a deep dive into those strategies, because obviously, like the whole point is to give people actionable solutions they can take to actually solve the problem, right?
Yeah.
But just before we do get into that, you mentioned that obviously, I guess the most common ones that you notice are like sadness, anxiety, or just any emotion that's stronger than normal, or like what it should be for a certain situation in terms of, let's say, going through a certain trigger or a certain experience. And obviously we all kind of know that, right? Because as time goes on, if you're an adult, if you've lived in any sort of way, like you're gonna have at least hints of that in your life, right?
I
Now,
think everybody does, even people who think
exactly.
they don't. So I did an e-course with Dr. Dan Siegel, who's an expert in interpersonal
Oh, okay.
neurobiology, and he talked about triggers. And when he first was getting trained in a kind of trauma therapy, he basically said, I didn't have any trauma, so I have nothing to do for this practice session. And then when they pressed him and said, everybody has trauma, he came up with one that turned out was a really unresolved loss and trauma for him. And so even people who think they don't have trauma, even very educated people in the field who think they don't have trauma, that's unresolved. Because being a child is a rough situation, period. You're at the mercy of people much bigger of yourself. You're totally dependent on them for survival. Human beings, we're helpless for a very long time. I mean, newborn babies can't even make their arms go where they want them to. I mean, they can't do much of anything.
Yeah.
So that sets up being really dependent on another. And how that early relationship goes in the first year sets up a whole way that we tend to think relationships go for the rest of our lives. And we can move towards more inner security if we didn't get it initially. But that takes recognizing that we don't have it, and it takes some strategies to get there, right? So, it's not that I'm saying if you had a bad childhood that it's all over. I'm saying if you had any kind of childhood, you have some of this. And that we could all learn strategies that can be helpful for moving towards more inner security and more feeling of knowing what our triggers are. It's unresolved trauma that causes us trouble. So it's really important to identify what were those things that were traumatic. And, one thing I do is have people write down 10 traumas quickly, and that's hard to do for most people. I mean, unless you had a really bad childhood. I mean, we did have one individual who could write subcategories under those 10, but it was a traumatic childhood. I think that, we all have ones, and I find people come up with different ones if you do that exercise over and over again, things that they might have thought of. And it's not always things that happen to them. It's sometimes things that happen to a sibling or somebody close to them that was traumatic for them to observe. So it could be something that happened to your dad in front of you, or that you saw, or that affected him. Maybe he lost his job, and that didn't happen to you. But if it changed who he was in relation to you, then, that's a trauma. You know what I mean? So it may not be his fault or anything that he did on purpose, but, his whole world got shaken, so then he might be different.
Got it. Yeah, 100%. Now, can you just go through like a few common examples of like early life stressors that normally leads to certain types of like emotional triggers when you're an adult? Because oftentimes, not always, but oftentimes it's caused by a caregiver, right? Or someone that you have like a lot of, like dependency on like a parent, maybe an older sibling or a teacher, right? So if you can, I guess just so people are aware, because sometimes people do this to other people without knowing, you know what I mean? So like,
Right.
if you can give us some examples of like things that lead to these emotional triggers in your adult life, that would be great, just so people are aware.
Sure. Sure. I mean, it partly has to do with how attuned your caregivers are in that early time. Are they really present for you? And they don't have to be perfect, by the way. You get a secure attachment from a caretaker who gets it right 30% of the time. So
Mm-hmm.
there's no perfect parents. I'm not trying to stress parents here because I would guess that some of the people listening to this are parents. But,
Yeah,
but, but when we have unresolved trauma and loss ourselves, when we try to parent, then we get triggered at times. And so we're not going to be as responsive to our child and what's going on for them because we're back in our own experience of what it was like to be a child. Maybe their crying is reminiscent of our crying when we were a child, or they're hurt or whatever it might be. So that can be important. And then it can be things that are really, a parent that doesn't think feelings are important or doesn't tune into those. They think all that matters is maybe having a couple good books at home and everything will be fine. Um, you know, that's another kind of strategy. Or there's still unresolved things from their own childhood that are intruding. So anyhow, those are some of the things that happen with caregivers. But, humiliating experiences, being made to stand in front of the class and being made fun of in some way, being, ostracized by other kids in school setting, because, instinctually we survived as a species by coming together. We
that's right.
didn't have the biggest teeth or, longest claws. That's just not who we are. So
Mm-hmm.
we dealt with things by coming together. And if you feel excluded from the group, it feels like you're not going to survive. Now, if you're ignored on the playground by all the other kids in your class, you're not going to die, but it feels like you are. It's just there's no more
Yeah.
lions around. So, you don't need that in the same way, but it sure feels like it. And it feels life or death. It could be being lost somewhere and feeling like you didn't matter, whether that's by your parent or on a trip or whatever, even if it's a
Mm-hmm.
short period of time, it feels like not being cared about. Um, I think about, can be very specific incidents. Like I think about, Dan talks about his daughter they were climbing in the Rockies and she ran ahead because she wanted to beat her brother down the mountain. And she got hit in the head by a rock that was loosened by somebody walking above her.
Mm.
It's one of those switchback trails
Yeah.
she had to be airlifted out by helicopter. I mean, it was very
Really.
traumatic. Her parents thought she might not survive it. She turned out to be fine. But, who knows? She really, it was a serious thing. And it changed her behavior until they talked it through and resolved that trauma. you know so those things, that was just an incident that happened, right? Not anybody's fault exactly. Another example, the one that Dan gave in his trauma thing, was when his dog died when he was a kid, and it was a puppy, but it ate some poison that he had put out to kill bugs on the strawberry plants. um,
Yeah.
so he's hypervigilant for danger and worried that his actions could hurt somebody, or inaction. So he's very hyper aware of those things. So, that's something that stuck with him from that experience.
Got it. Okay, yeah, yeah, that's great. So obviously, first you mentioned when it comes down to your caregivers, most parents, I mean, as we all know, they're not trying to hurt their kid, right? Like it's just like it makes no sense, right? Like they're not trying to hurt their kid, but as you said, because of their own unresolved trauma, oftentimes you just kind of like impose like your inner world onto other people, right? So like if you have low confidence, right, you might impose the fear of failure onto your kid, or you might try and use your kid as like some sort of a symbol to kind of fill a void that you have on the inside, and you're doing that, without actually knowing, right? But that
Right.
kind of experience is hurting the kid, because like the kid is kind of being raised to believe that love is kind of like conditional, or that you should never make any mistakes, and that can lead to a lot of problems as time goes on, right? And you also
Right.
mentioned parents that don't validate your emotions, right? So you don't feel safe telling them anything, right? And again, that could come down to their own upbringing. Maybe it has to do, with like culture and stuff like that. Obviously, now things are changing dramatically, but like, even like 30 years ago, it was a different world in terms of how people spoke about emotions, right? So like, so much of it just has to do with how they are raised, and what they went through, and the, I guess, the lack of awareness that comes with it. Because as you get more aware, you can kind of, as you say, name it and figure out what's going on, right? So that's really interesting about the caregivers. And then
Right.
obviously outside of that, being humiliated, being ostracized by your friends, and just having like destabilizing types of experiences that, I guess, in a sense makes a person feel like they're not good enough, right? I guess that's kind of
Right.
the core idea with that, correct?
Right. Right. And you internalize some belief. So
Mm-hmm.
another example I can think of is a person who, as a child, really wanted a bike, and they kept asking for a bike and asking for a bike. Anyhow, they finally got it. They went to ride and they hit something and they fell on their face. So then, as an adult, they really wanted a particular job and they worked their way up the job ladder. They really earned that job, but then they got it and they kept having the feeling like, oh, I'm going to fall on my face. Same thing that happened to
Yeah,
the
yeah,
but it's not, now it's a totally different situation, right? But that
yeah,
feeling was leading to a lot of anxiety
yeah,
and, was going to interfere with their job performance. In a way, we
absolutely.
make these self fulfilling prophecies come true because then we act differently. So if we can catch on to what's going on, we don't have to reenact it. The whole thing is when we're kind of an autopilot, we're reenacting the past and we relive some of the worst things that happened to us over and over again. If we can
That's right.
identify what they are and resolve that trauma, then we don't have to relive it. We can become the active authors of our future.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So that was a really good overview on, I guess, where emotional triggers come from, and why they're important. And obviously, like as we spoke about, the whole idea for this episode is to give people solutions that they can use to overcome this, right? Now, one of the things that you spoke about just recently was naming it. And in your blog, you call it name it to tame it, or I guess that's a strategy that you learned from someone else, right? So can you tell us what this strategy is and why is it so effective?
Okay. It naming it to tame it requires having an emotional vocabulary because you have to name what the experience is. And the more exactly you can name it, the better. So not just bad, but dread or terror or whatever it might be. That the more you can name it, the better. And this
Mm-hmm.
actually comes from research they did in a brain scanner. So they had people look at very emotionally upsetting pictures. And then they said, tell me the color of shirt the person's wearing in each picture. Well, that doesn't calm your brain down. Your brain
Mm-hmm.
still is super activated by these pictures. But if you ask people to name the main emotion going on in the picture, that does calm down their brain, even when they're looking at very emotionally laden stimuli. So if we can name the internal experience we're having, it does calm down our brain. And so naming what the feeling is. There's a list of feeling words that when I like, which it comes from a book that Sue Johnson wrote called Hold Me Tight, 7 Conversations for a Better Relationship or something like that. And her idea is, what's the core feeling that gets triggered in you when you're having a fight with your significant other? And if you can name that, guess what? You don't have to get so overwhelmed by it each time. And there's a list of all different words. And when you find the one that's you, it's kind of like, oh, yeah, that's it. And then it's not only when you have a fight with your spouse. Let's say your boss says something critical towards you. Oh, that's what I was feeling again. Oh,
Yeah.
a friend doesn't show up for a meetup or something, and you go, oh, wait, that's what I'm feeling again. It's really interesting that when we can identify those things, we get an idea about what's going on inside us. And when we have a strong overreaction to something that's negative, we're probably triggering an old feeling. And it feels like it's happening now. It doesn't feel like you're remembering. It feels like you're in it. And that's what implicit memory is. It's, implicit memory develops before we have hippocampus is fully developed. It's part of our brain that's involved in what we usually consider memory.
Hmm.
And the example I often give people is, if I brought out a bicycle, you wouldn't think, how do I ride a bicycle? You would just ride, right? Because
Yeah.
motor memory is implicit. But if I ask you to tell me the story of who taught you to ride a bike, you'd try to remember and it'd feel like you're remembering and you would tell me some version of that story, right? And that's a
Hmm.
very different thing. That's a memory. But implicit memories just get triggered and we just feel like we're back in that old situation. Now, for riding a bike, that's great because then we just know how to ride it. We don't have to think about it. But for trauma memories, that's not so great. And often trauma
Hmm.
memories are implicit, even if we're older than 3 or 4 when our hippocampus gets developed, because the higher functions of our brain often shut down when something traumatic is going on.
Hmm. Got it.
So,
Okay.
so it
Yeah, go
just
ahead.
doesn't get encoded. It doesn't get encoded in the same way.
Got it. That's interesting. Okay. Now, like, is there a reason that naming it calms your brain down? Like, why does that happen? What makes it calming in a sense? Like, is it because you're moving from like, being emotional to logic? Is that what's going on? Like, what's the reason behind that?
There's probably a number of things going on. One is that, you know, our right brain is where the seat of more of our emotions is, and our amygdala. And there's this part of our brain actually called the middle prefrontal cortex that has fibers that go down to that amygdala. And I think naming it is kind of like your amygdala, your this middle prefrontal cortex hugging your amygdala.
Oh, got it. That's a good
It's
analogy. Yeah.
it's sort of
It's a good image.
surrounding,
Yeah.
and because you're bringing that part online by saying the name of the feeling. You're also involving your left brain, which is more language based. So you're giving a name to it, which is integrating brain regions. So whenever you're working from different aspects of your brain together, you're integrating the brain. You're doing something
Got it.
positive for your well being. I also think that for us, language based as we are, have putting words to it contains it for us, puts it in a container instead of it just sort of free floating around us. The more we can be specific, it's like when you're anxious, if you know what you're anxious about, you don't feel as bad as when it's just free floating anxiety and you don't really have any idea what it's
Hmm.
about. That's scarier, more overwhelming.
Yeah. 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 Exactly.
So
Got it.
think that's part of what works. But what they've shown in brain scanners is that whatever the mechanism, your brain stops firing as much. It just calms down when you put a name to a feeling. And partly we're not great at having, we don't educate kids as much as we should. I mean, there's some programs in some schools, but certainly not universally,
Hmm.
about naming feelings. And what am I feeling? you know and the more we can do that and what it feels like in our body when we have that feeling, and the more we do that for kids, the better it is. And there are programs. There's a program out of Yale Child Study Center called the ladder program or the ruler program, but it talks about feelings both in terms of good and bad, but also about intensity. And it really looks at naming a whole bunch of different feelings very specifically. And that's really helpful. The more the kids have that language, the more they can say, oh, this is what's happening.
Yeah.
They're going to feel better and they're going to feel more in control of what's going on inside them.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah. So like it's just about making sure that they are aware, right? Because as you mentioned, when you don't know what's going on or like why you're feeling what you're feeling, it just takes it to a whole new level, right? Because you're confused, and the last thing human beings want is to be in a place where you have no idea what's going on. So obviously, giving people that clarity and that language, that emotional language, it again, it moves them more into like a logical way of thinking and kind of separates them from just reacting in terms of like whatever emotion they're going through, right? So again, I mean, it takes
Yep.
practice though. As you probably know, it takes practice to get, I guess, really good at this. But yeah, that's really interesting.
Yeah, it does.
Yeah. Now, something else you also spoke about is called SIFT, or like sifting, right? So can you tell us what that strategy is and what makes it so effective?
Yeah. SIFT is an acronym that Dan Siegel came up with, and he loves acronyms.
Hmm.
It's looking for sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts. So while you're sitting with something, looking for any sensations in your body, any images that come to mind. They don't have to make sense. You'll figure it out later. Feelings and thoughts. What comes up for you as you sit with a strong emotion? First of all, you're teaching distress tolerance right there. If you can just sit with an emotion and get curious about it, that's important in and of itself. If you can look for the sensations, images, feelings, and thoughts, then you might understand where it really comes from. Like I mentioned, the example of the image of the bicycle coming up for that woman, when she's facing a new job that she worked hard to get,
Yeah.
and feeling like she's going to fall on her face. And that's such an interesting image to come up. And once you make those kind of connections, it takes the drive out of that feeling. It takes the pressure out of it. It takes the intensity down. And so sifting is important. It also teaches you new things about yourself, and it helps you make sense of things that happen to you. So when somebody tells me they feel bad every morning when they wake up, I want them to sit with that feeling for a minute and really sift, go through their mind. Look, is there any sensations, images, and feelings and thoughts while I sit with this feeling? They also might rate it on a scale of 1 to 10. How bad is it this morning? It's usually not the same every morning. It's different. And that's important to notice. You don't feel bad in the same intensity every morning. You still feel bad in the morning, but sometimes it's a 1 and sometimes it's a 6 and sometimes it's a 10. That's good to know and pay attention to, that it is something that shifts. And how do we get it to be a 1 more often, or 0 would be nice too, but whatever it is. But also, how do we learn to just sit with our feelings? A lot of us are so phobic about feeling our feelings that we run from them. We try to shut them down or ignore them or drown them out. But if we can sit with them, we're actually going to be in a lot better place. Sometimes called distress tolerance. Can we tolerate being distressed? And the more we build our distress tolerance, because we're all going to have distressing moments. Life has distress in it. It has times when things are uncertain and we don't exactly understand what's going on or what we can do about it. And that's okay if we can sit with it. If we have to do something about it right away, then we're going to do something impulsive, maybe even self-destructive to try to deal with it. That's what I worry about.
Got it. Yeah. So that's pretty interesting, because it seems like, a core idea behind this strategy is to get into the present moment, right? And not let your mind go, somewhere else. Because as they say, when you're too much in the future, you tend to experience so much anxiety, right? And if you live in the past, you tend to feel depressed. But if you're in the moment, you tend to be level-headed, right? So would you say that one of the goals of using this type of strategy is to get the person to get into the present moment instead of, having their mind oftentimes go too far into the future or the past?
Yeah, it is being present. It's checking in with your body and what's going on. It's being, able to experience that. And you're getting to know yourself in a different way when you do that. And, your life's gonna go better if you know yourself and understand your triggers, understand your intense feelings, and know that you can sit with them for a while, that you can think before you act. You don't have to just do something, to try to get rid of that feeling, and that you have some power in shifting it, but you have to first of all understand what it is and make some sense out of it. So, and it's not that you have to figure out every detail or whatever, but the SIFT is just paying attention to what is going on in your own body about it.
Got it. Great. Yeah, that's great. Now, something else you also speak about is called is a strategy called R.A.I.N, right? So, what is this strategy? And again, what makes it effective when dealing with emotional triggers?
Right. It's actually an ancient Buddhist strategy. And the R stands for recognize. So recognize what you're experiencing when you're having a strong emotional reaction. I would say that the R is really a name it to tame it idea.
Yeah.
Recognize, okay, I'm feeling that again. Okay, then the A of R.A.I.N is really 3 A's. Accept what is, because you don't really have a choice. Allow it to be, because this too will pass.
Mm-hmm.
and acknowledge it. So I often have people write down, okay, so here's what it was. Let's put a word to it. Let's actually put it on paper. Or you can put it in your phone, but handwriting actually helps you process things more than typing. So just
Uh-huh.
going to put it out there. Um, and then the I is of R.A.I.N is investigate. What is it? When have I had this feeling before? What might this have to do with? And there I like the S.I.F.T again. Go through, just
Mm-hmm.
sit with it and
Yeah.
see what it might have to do with. And just be curious about it. You know, if a really compassionate perspective to have toward yourself is to be radically curious, curious about what's going on inside of you. It's also, by the way, a really good strategy to have towards people, others.
Yeah.
Don't think you know what they're feeling. Be really curious about what they're feeling. Don't think you know how they're going to behave. Be really curious about how they're going to behave. If you do that with friends and people you're close to, you're going to learn a lot more. And you're going to have much better relationships if you could be radically curious.
Yeah.
With your children, be radically curious about what's going on inside them. Be radically curious about why they did that, not judgmental. And toward yourself, why not just treat yourself like you would treat a good friend? We tend to be much nicer to other people than ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can have that curiosity about what's going on, instead of immediately jumping to a judgment, then it's very different, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, then the end of it is don't over identify with it. You might be
Don't
real,
over-identify.
don't over identify. So you may in a moment be really upset, but you're not always that upset. Nobody's always
Mm-hmm.
anything. You might be really angry, but that doesn't mean you're an angry person. You're angry right
Yeah.
this moment. You know what I mean? Don't over identify with it. Don't take on the label
Mm-hmm.
of it. You might have had a really traumatic thing happen to you, like sexual abuse, and you are a sexual abuse survivor. It informs who you are, but it doesn't define who you are.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing, no one thing, even a trauma, it defines who you are. You're a multifaceted individual, it's got a lot of different parts to you. And it's important to
Yeah.
recognize that. So you might have a very strong feeling, but it's not who you are all the time. So you might have a failure, something happens. You think you lost something that was really important or valuable. Our tendency is to beat ourselves up. How could I have done that? What an idiot. I'm always failing, blah, blah, blah. But the reality is, no, you're not always failing. Maybe sometimes you are, but not always. And, you know, don't jump on that train of defining yourself by one thing, even if it's something important, you know?
Mm-hmm.
And I was just reading a book where a person thinks they've lost a valuable violin that belonged to their grandmother. But it turns out they put it on a different bench. They're just looking at the bench that they thought was the bench that they had left it on, but it was the one next to it, and it was sitting right there still.
Mm-hmm.
But meanwhile, they'd gone
Mm-hmm.
through a whole battery of beating themselves up about
Yeah.
nothing that didn't even happen. But we tend to
Mm-hmm.
do that. We tend to jump on, to some old image or definition of who we are that isn't accurate, because no one thing defines us and no one word, and kids, I mean, we used to do this even more than we do it now, but, the smart one, the stupid one, the funny one, the whatever. Yeah, those things might be true about you, but they're not all of who you are, even the good ones.
Mm-hmm.
you know,
Yeah.
the good kid is not always good, right? The bad kid is not always bad. It's better to see things on a
As people.
spectrum as people with
Yeah.
all different aspects to them and to
Yeah.
treat yourself like that, you know, because we're multifaceted. We're not one thing.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
And so that's the R.A.I.N. And it's an ancient Buddhist practice, but a lot of people have brought it into the current day because it's so important as a technique. And I can't tell you how many clients I have that use that and find it really, really helpful.
Yeah. So Rain, recognize, accept, investigate, and don't over-identify with it, right? So I guess that's really interesting. It seems like many of these, like tactics are kind of like intertwined in a way. Like they all kind of serve each other. Obviously, as you mentioned, name it to tame it is with the R. Sifting can be used for like investigating. That's pretty interesting. It's intertwined. Now, something that you
Yeah.
spoke about is handwriting, right? Which is also something that you do write about in a separate blog. You talk about the power of writing, right? So, can
Hmm.
you tell us, okay, if a person wanted to use writing, first of all, why is it powerful, and how can they implement this strategy into their life?
Right. Taking 5 minutes a day to write down about, especially anything that happened that uh, was upset you, is a great idea. It helps you process it. You know, it helps you make
Yeah.
sense of it, helps you put words to it. If you're writing about triggers, so when you've gotten triggered and you've had a big emotional reaction, write about it and just write anything that comes to mind, what, if you feel about it. And, sitting down and writing about anything traumatic that's happened to you uh, actually really helps. And the person who studied this was a guy named Penny Baker. And he had college students, the students in his classes that he was teaching, write, he had half of them write just about what they wore every day,
Mm.
which doesn't help your brain a whole lot or your mood. But then he had the others write about something traumatic that happened to them that they hadn't told anybody. And those students not only found that incredibly helpful, they also didn't get as sick in the next year. It boosts your immune system to write about
Really?
trauma. Isn't that interesting?
Mm. That is
It makes
interesting.
you,
Yeah.
it helps your mental and physical health. So it's a really good idea to write about anything traumatic that happens because, in essence, you're making it a resolved trauma rather than an unresolved trauma. And it's not that you have to
Hmm.
resolve it, all in your first writing about it, but even just getting it down on paper, you can start to address it, right? And you start to take more control over it because you're the active author of that paper you're writing on. You're
Yeah.
writing, and that makes it more under your control. And there's been now studies done with all different populations, not just college students, that show that it actually really helps to write about traumatic things that happen. And it could be that
Mm.
you're in a car accident. It might not even be your fault, right? You might be in a 20-car pileup in the ice, there's nothing you could do. The guy behind you stopped, the guy in back of you kept going, you know, but that was traumatic. I don't, it doesn't matter, right? It feels
Hmm.
terrifying in the moment. Write about it. And maybe it's not, doesn't hit the core of who you are, but it might in some way.
Hmm.
I think about somebody who had a very traumatic thing happen when they were little, and every time something would go wrong in their life currently, even minor things, they felt like, oh, see, you're being punished because you're a bad person because you did this thing when you were a kid. So it's lots of feelings come up that aren't about, now, excuse me, go back. Oh, here I am. Okay. Don't know where I went. I
Yeah,
was
no
trying to
problem.
get
You're here.
popping up. Anyhow, so basically, it's really helpful to write about it. Why write it in by hand? It turns out that actually helps you process more. The
Mm.
problem with typing is it just doesn't process as much. It's still better
Mm.
than not writing. If the only way I'm gonna get you to write it down is on your computer or on your phone, great, do it. But it's
Hmm.
even better if you put it in handwriting. And this is true for taking notes, by the way, too. People who are still in school, if you take notes by hand, you'll remember it more than you will if you type it. And that's just a
Mm.
fact.
That's really interesting. Yeah. So, okay, first of all, yeah. So you mentioned obviously just 5 minutes a day. Like as a practice, 5 minutes a day. You write about things that you feel. Things that may have been traumatizing to you that you haven't told anyone. And as you do that practice on a consistent basis, it has pretty significant positive like effects on your mental health, right? Now you, you
Yeah.
you said something that's so interesting. Like it makes people, well, like according to that study, it makes people less sick and like actual like physically ill, right? It like what is the reason for that? Like is it because your body is no longer fighting the constant, like stress response with not knowing how to deal with certain like unresolved trauma? Like what makes it good at kind of lowering your illnesses on a physical level?
Right. It's boosting your immune system is what it's doing. And why
Yes.
that
Hmm.
is we don't know exactly the mechanism. We know the fact of it. What the mechanism might be something like you're less stressed. It might be something like you're sleeping better. It might be something
Yeah, there's
like
multiple
you're
multiple factors.
you're not, eating badly to deal with the stress. You're eating
Yeah.
more healthy. It might be that you're just your body isn't in activation mode as much. So you're not in that activated alarm state. You're calmer. Um,
Yeah.
and so it's hard to exactly know, but there's all partly parts of all those things happening. Um, and also, if you're blocking something out of your awareness, that takes a lot of energy. So if you're trying to
Hmm.
keep that trauma out of your mind, that takes being pretty hyper vigilant. So what they find is if they stress people if their strategy for dealing with stuff is to just put it under their awareness, when you give them math problems that are difficult, they can't do it anymore and the stuff starts popping out.
Hmm.
We take a lot of mental effort uh,
Yeah.
keeping things below our awareness. And so uh, it really helps to get it out there and not keep it out of our awareness, make it part of our awareness, but it doesn't have to take us over either. And for those people who tend to turn up the volume on stuff, instead of being all upset about it, they're writing about it and they're making sense
Hmm.
out of it. So that actually brings it back down to the right level, sort of. Whereas people who are suppressing it, it brings it back up to the right level to write about it and make it part of our awareness. So it doesn't have to overwhelm us, but we need to deal with it. So after hearing Dan's story about his daughter and what they did to help her with the behavior problems that came after that accident is they all went to a park, her brother, her mother and father, whole family, sat and each one told their story about that incident. And they slowed it down when they got close to the actual rock falling part.
Oh.
And each
Mm.
told it from their perspective. And his daughter, she was 10 years old, but she started to fall asleep. This was in the middle of the day when it got close to that incident. But they'd wake her up
Hmm.
and they'd go through it, and everybody did it. All the behavior problems, the sleeping problems, they all went away.
Wow, that's really
Why?
interesting.
Because it was a resolved trauma.
Yeah.
So I had a
Yeah.
nephew who we were out on two little boats, and he was swimming between the boats because the person watching him in one boat said he could swim over to the boat where his dad was, but he
Hmm.
didn't have the swimming skills to do that. So he jumped
Oh.
in, but then he was flailing. And before they had a conscious thought about it, both his father and his uncle jumped in. And they ended up saving him, and he was saved or whatever. His other cousins were there too. So that evening when I was hanging out with them, the kids, I was like, oh, so tell the story of what happened. And we made sense out of
Yeah.
it because that could be an unresolved trauma because he could have drowned. He didn't,
Yeah.
and his story was, oh, my dad jumped in and saved me. And I'm so, which was a good
Hmm.
story, and it's true. It's what happened. But
Yeah.
and he was really angry at the person who let him jump in. And he had all these feelings about it, but we talked about all the different feelings. And that was important, um, because I
Yeah.
wanted it to be a resolved trauma. I didn't want it to be a trauma that he had ongoing,
Lingers. Yeah.
visiting him or kept him from swimming. A lot of people have swimming trauma as kids. And you know what? They usually don't swim as adults
Yeah.
because they don't want to get to that old scary feeling. And, yet as adults, they're probably able to do the swimming.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Sometimes people just need, like a release, right? To kind of get whatever weight they might be holding inside. And that's pretty interesting how it opens up everything. Like, like you mentioned, his daughter, like she fell asleep and had no issues after that, which is really, it shows you how effective it is, right?
It's really effective to process it.
Hmm.
And, this was a trauma that it wasn't somebody did it to her on purpose, but it was a really
Yeah.
scary, being, 10 years old and going off in a helicopter by yourself, not knowing what's happening,
Yeah.
your head's hurting, it's pretty traumatic. And,
Hmm.
and her parents thinking she might be dying. She wasn't.
Hmm.
Um, she turned out to be, like I said, just fine, but, you know, you could imagine, all the feelings around her, what she was feeling. It's pretty
Yeah.
scary. And,
Yeah.
she didn't get to accomplish her goal of getting down the mountain before her brother. It was what she was really focused on at that moment.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that's really interesting. And something you also spoke about is how handwriting allows you to process more. And like if you type, it can be effective, but it's not the best because it doesn't help you process as well. Is there a reason for that? Like what makes it different? Because I mean, at the end of the day, you're both strategies allow you to kind of like release, right? But like what makes it, I guess, significantly different?
It's hard to know, but it's, it's part of why, we stopped having kids do handwriting for a while there
Yeah, it's
because
been a
we thought,
while.
why? They're all going to type, right?
Yeah.
When they get to be adults. But the thing is, they're putting it back because it actually helps with brain development. So they're
Hmm.
actually putting it
That's
back in
so interesting.
classrooms now. It's so interesting. But we have a whole like group of kids who just didn't get that. Um, but it's just helpful for processing. I think partly because it's physical and you're actually moving your hand. I mean, I don't know. It's different than just fingers. I don't know.
It's
Different
more
process.
effort. Like it like there's more effort when you write, you know what I mean? So you're kind of like more immersed in it. Like with typing, it's a lot easier than actually sitting there and writing. So that might play a reason, but I mean I have no idea, right? In terms of
Right,
what
right.
makes it more effective. Yeah.
Yeah, we don't know, but we do know that getting it down helps. And then being able to
Mm,
revisit it, because now it's on paper or it's on your phone or wherever it is, you can revisit it and you can make more and more sense of that story because sometimes we'll remember things that make it easier, make it less
yeah.
traumatic than it was, that aren't quite true. Like we'll
Hmm.
think a stranger did something to us that actually maybe our parent did. Because it's a little easier to accept that it was somebody that wasn't our parent, but it's harder to
Yeah.
accept parent.
Yeah.
So I think in revisiting those stories, sometimes they get modified a bit and we start
Hmm.
to get at more the root of what really the issues were. But the first step is getting it out there.
100%. 100%. Great. Now, Dr. Firestone, so obviously, like we've been talking about many different strategies that people can use, right? Now, the thing is, these strategies are kind of like intellectual and introspective in nature. Now, are there situations in life where that might not be the most effective? Because, like for me, like oftentimes, like I've noticed, like if I have like a really like intense emotion, being able to kind of like release it on a like a physical level tends to be more effective in like getting me to get more in control of my emotions, right? Because oftentimes, again, I'm just speaking from like my personal experience, right? If I try to use my intellect in like a really intense moment, it might help, but it's not as effective as like burning it out quickly through like a physical act, right? So are there situations that call for other tactics and just ones that aren't necessarily like intellectual in nature?
Right. Well, I think that's another way people can get out emotions in the moment is doing physical activity. And I
Yeah.
think that can be really constructive, especially if it's something like exercise or going for a run or, doing something, as long as they're not doing it in a way that's damaging to themselves. Because some people
Yeah.
do push themselves to extremes, and that can be not ideal. But, doing
Hmm.
something physical is great, and there's nothing wrong with that. But it doesn't organize it so that you won't be
Hmm.
visited by it again in the same
Yeah.
way. So you might do that first, take the edge off of what's going on, but then come back to
Yeah.
it and see if you could just jot down a few things about it so that you can start to identify it. So you're not just having to get up and run all the time or getting up
Hmm.
and, or go swimming or whatever it might be. And there's nothing bad about those strategies are way better than letting it overwhelm you.
Hmm.
So,
Hmm.
or acting it out in some way that's destructive. So I'm all for the physical strategies, but I'm also for making sense out of it.
Yeah.
So,
Hmm.
because then it doesn't have to bother you again. Now, there's a difference between making sense of it or getting it out there than feeding it. And some people feed their feelings. So, not only am I wronged in this situation, let me tell you 10 other things this person's done wrong to me in my life, especially with our partners. We keep these lists, that we could pull out conveniently when we're feeding a feeling of anger or resentment.
Yeah. Yeah.
And you know what? That's really not helpful. And some
Yeah.
people do that with all their feelings. they tend to feel something and then they feed it. And those are the
Hmm.
people who are turning
That's
up the
right.
volume,
That's right.
right? So they're feeling this, but now they're turning up the volume. That's not helpful because then you're not responding to what's really going on. You're responding to 10 times the volume, you know? Then it's better to take a break, do
Hmm.
something else, go for a run first, calm it all down, and then you can revisit it.
Yeah.
But don't start making those lists. You're on the wrong track when you're breaking out the laundry list of complaints about a person, whether
Yeah.
it's your parent or whether it's your child or whether it's your spouse. Not
Hmm.
helpful, or your friend, doesn't matter, you know? And when you're telling yourself how bad it is that they did that to you and you're feeding that you're the victim, that's never you don't want to put yourself as the victim because you know what? That puts you in a very powerless place, and you're not
Yeah.
powerless in your life today. If you're an adult, you have choices. If you really don't like how somebody treats you, you can decide to not have that person in your life. You can make choices. When you're a kid, you don't have much power. You can't say, "Oh, I don't like
Yeah.
this family. I think I'll live with those people next door. I like them a lot better."
Yeah.
You don't get those kind of choices as a kid. You're
Yeah.
captive in a sense. But as an
Hmm.
adult, you really have choices. And I can't tell you how many adults want to say they have no choices, but they do. You don't like this
Yeah.
job, you could leave it. You might be
Yeah.
unemployed. I can't guarantee that you're going to get another one, but
It's
but
going to
you
be
can,
turbulent. It's turbulent and tough, but you do have more choice, as you mentioned, right? In comparison to
yeah, you
being
have
like
choice, you
12.
have more
Yeah.
personal power, you have more ability to choose who you want to be around. You know, you lots of choices. And it's important
Hmm.
to own your personal power, that you have power. You're not a victim as an adult.
Hmm.
I mean, if you're having a gun held to your head, okay, you're a victim in that moment, you know,
Yeah.
or you're being taken hostage or something. Okay, yeah, you're a victim. But in almost no situations, I mean, most of us are not held at gunpoint very often or held hostage. We
Yeah.
are walking around making choices in our life. We're not a
Hmm.
victim. And if we don't like how somebody treated us, we can address it. We can walk away from it. We can do all kinds of things. We can stop doing what we do just before they do the thing that we don't like.
Hmm.
You know, we have power, but we don't have power to change them. We have power to change us
Yeah.
and what. And so many people want to change the other person.
Hmm.
That they can't do. They
Yeah.
can shift how they act, which will shift your partner too, by the way.
Hmm. 100%. Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So basically what you're saying is obviously, you can use some other outlet, but oftentimes going back to actually getting to the root of the problem by studying it tends to be, I guess, obviously the most effective thing, right? Because when you do like get rid of those really intense emotions through a physical outlet, it puts you in the place mentally that allows you to actually be more introspective in the first place, right? So I guess
Right.
it's again, it's a combination. Now,
Yeah.
outside of
It is
yeah,
introspective, by the way, but it's not always intellectual. So you're also listening to
yeah, I
what are the
100%.
messages you're getting from your body? What are the images that are coming to mind? Those aren't intellectual. They're
Yeah,
just, you know, you're paying attention
introspective.
to them. Right. They are
Hmm.
introspective.
Got it. Okay. Now, is there anything else outside of like a physical release that you can think of in terms of a strategy that people can use, or no?
And
Just
I think
just just in
there's
case.
millions of them. I think,
Oh, there are.
when we, yeah, and when we introduce people to dealing with this, we give them a toolkit of things they can do that help them calm down. You
Hmm.
know, mindfulness meditation is definitely one of those tools,
Okay, there we go. Yeah.
that helps people because it's exercising that muscle of attention, of putting your attention where you want to put it, and if you do things that are rhythmical and predictable, it tends to calm you down, like going for a walk, because you pick up one foot, you're going to put down the other. It
Yeah.
applies to a run also, right? Uh, Breathing. If you pay attention to your breathing, when you breathe in, you're going to breathe out. When you breathe out, you're going to breathe in. These are predictable, right?
Hmm.
You know? So those things do help calm you down. Putting one hand over your heart and one hand over your belly and taking deep breaths tends to center you back in yourself. So you're not off to the races in some way or another. You're back to yourself. It also is a good strategy for getting out of feeding your feelings, is just try to
Yeah.
sink, let that go, take some deep breaths, sink back into your body.
Mm-hmm.
And I partly got this from a violence prevention program, that when we get triggered, and for some people that goes towards getting aggressive, they can get on the train of those thoughts, or they can kind of let go of that and come back to themselves. And then they can
Mm-hmm.
act for more from a place of real kindness and humanity. Um, we can do 4-7-8 breathing that calms us down. That's breathing in for a count of 4, holding it for a count of 7, breathing out for a
Huh.
count of 8. If you do that 5 times in a row, it releases serotonin in your brain, your natural
Yeah.
serotonin, and calms your brain right down. And you could do that in a grocery store line. Nobody knows have to know you're doing it.
Mm-hmm.
You know, you can do it if you're trying to fall asleep and you're not falling asleep. It often helps.
Mm-hmm.
And what's important about it is breathing out more than you breathe in. Some people do 3-6-6. That's fine too. Breathe in for 3, hold it for
Yeah.
6,
Elongate
blow
the
out
exhale.
for.
Yeah.
It's more exhale than inhale is the issue.
Mm-hmm.
Calms you down. You know,
Got it.
so it's the opposite of hyperventilating, where we're breathing in more than we're breathing out,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
which you know, not good.
Yeah.
So
Got
those
it.
are just
Mm-hmm.
some things. So, and
That's a
some
lot.
form of
Yeah.
mindfulness practice just help. So there's lots of things we can do, and you can find the one that works for you,
Mm-hmm.
or the combination. So I need to go do a burst of physical activity and then come back and do, or I need to do some breathing and then I can address whatever.
Mm-hmm.
But we can do whatever works for us.
Got it. Got it. Yeah, that's great. That's great. Now, something else that I wanted to quickly talk to you about is the like human nervous system, right? Because obviously, when you are going through an emotional trigger, it's your nervous system that's just like having an overreaction in a sense, right? Now, again, we spoke about where that comes from. Now, is it possible to like rewire your nervous system and get it back to a place where you're just not having that trigger in the first place, right? And if yes, obviously we spoke about many practices, but are there specific practices that allow a person to rewire their nervous system and eventually overcome this phase where they're actually not having these triggers in the first place?
Right. I mean, I think there's a lot of good data that when we write about it, we are rewiring our nervous system. We're also rewiring our brain,
Interesting.
because we're using different parts of our brain, and we're building more integration in our brain. And the more integrated our brain, and meaning that the areas are differentiated, but they link, we do better.
Got it.
Okay. So whenever we're improving differentiation and linkage, we are helping. So, a burst of physical activity sends a lot of blood flow to the brain. That might be a positive, right? In this case,
Mm-hmm.
get
Mm-hmm.
everything really activated and working well. So they're all different processes, but, we have this nerve at the base of our brain called the vagus nerve, and it really regulates our nervous system, and it looks at the environment at all times. Is it safe? If it's safe, we'll use our words, we'll make eye contact, we'll express
Mm-hmm.
ourselves more directly with language. But if we think the environment is dangerous, we get into fight or flight. Or sometimes for women, tend and befriend. We got to get along and we got to make it all work, and
Yeah.
this is researched stuff. It comes. So we do things because sometimes for women, fighting wasn't the most effective strategy. Befriending our enemy was the best strategy, and
Yeah,
acting
that's
like
right.
we were going along. And we're talking
Mm-hmm.
survival in very rough situations.
Mm-hmm.
So I don't mean that doesn't lead to problems later on, by the way, but
Yeah, it
so
does.
if
Yeah.
we think it's dangerous, we do something. And in
Mm-hmm.
that, we get in a very reactive state. And then if it's life threatening, or we perceive it to be life threatening, and you got to remember, when you're a little child, a lot more things look life threatening than do to you as an adult. So if you're an adult observing a parent walk out of a room to get a bottle for a baby that's crying, they're trying to meet their needs. But if you're that
Mm-hmm.
baby, they just abandon you. You don't know that.
Mm-hmm.
That's
Mm-hmm.
terrifying, right? So it's a different perception, and many things seem life-threatening from the child's perspective. So,
Mm-hmm.
we got to remember that we have that we were that child and we felt those things. And we
Mm-hmm.
sometimes still feel like that's what's happening. So when we feel like it's actually life threatening, we sometimes go into shutdown. And,
Mm-hmm.
this is the idea, like if you see a cat carrying a mouse in its mouth, it's caught a mouse. The mouse is laying there looking like it's dead, right? It's floppy. And the cat puts it down, and 50% of the time, the mouse just runs
Runs
away
away. Yeah.
because it's just in that shutdown state. Because thrashing around while you're in a cat's mouth, not a good idea. You suffer more
Mm-hmm.
injuries. Really good to just shut down, get through the situation, and then get away. But
Mm-hmm.
for a big human brain that requires a lot of oxygen, when we go into shutdown, we literally are, quote, scared to death. We can actually die. We can
Yeah.
fall down. We can be so scared of public speaking that we faint. You know, um,
Yeah.
that's all part of that shutdown response. So when our nervous system is activated like that, doing something to calm it down is really important and to
Mm-hmm.
signal safety. And one of the things they do, Steve Porges and his group, who've done a lot of work with this vagus nerve idea, is something they call the safe and sound intervention. They play kids that have this super sensitivity, so often on the autism spectrum, to threat. They play them only high pitched music, no low tones, because low tones signal danger. And you know what?
Mm.
They start smiling and making eye contact. These kids who never smile or make eye contact. Why? Because they're not feeling threatened. And it's an intervention that they do over and over and over and actually really rewires their nervous system through this vagus,
Mm-hmm.
uh, showing that this is a safe environment. And I think this happens to all of us to some extent
Interesting.
as we become
Yeah.
adults and we realize we have some power and control. We start to feel safer. If we're in a really good relationship or we find we can actually count on this person over and over and over and over again, that can start to rewire our nervous system. So I
Yeah.
think a patient I have who had a very unpredictable, violent, scary childhood. But as an adult, what did she do? She got into a relationship with her husband, stayed in the same relationship for 40 years. She got a
Mm-hmm.
job. She went to college, got a job, stayed in that job for 40 years, lived in the same house for 40 years. Every time they'd look for a new house because they had a couple kids and they needed a bigger house, they'd stay in the same house. She couldn't leave it. But in that, she developed this very safe world that she created, even though it was a stressful job, even though obviously having two kids has its stresses, even though having, the same husband can cause some stresses. It created mostly safety and sameness and
Mm.
predictability. And it calmed her down and helped her develop internalized security.
Uh-huh.
So she could
That's
be a
really,
better
yeah.
mother to her kids than her mother was. So she could
Mm-hmm.
provide that stability to them. She created a stable life where she had no stability as a kid. And that's really different. But, when did she get upset? And when she come see me? When she got to her retirement age. And all of a sudden she was going to have to deal with maybe changing everything.
Yeah.
Uh, that was really scary. So it's
Mm-hmm.
interesting. Sameness was safety, change was scary, but yet she wants to retire at some point. And your husband was
Mm-hmm.
really pushing because he wanted to retire. Understandably, he was, of an age that was appropriate for that. They'd worked hard their whole lives. Um, but, there's choices you can make, you know, that help create. So for her, that created that sense of security and stability. Her nervous system calmed down, got less reactive until there was going to be change. And then boom, all this stuff came up that she hadn't really resolved all the way. She had just dealt with it.
God, yes, that's really interesting. So it seems like, using a combination of strategies to eventually put you in a place where you feel safe and you can kind of like predict what's going to happen when you are, in those situations where you experience those triggers, right? Again, this could take time. It could take 2, 3, 4, 5 years. But I guess, if you keep that idea at the front of your mind, you'll eventually get to a place where your nervous system is no longer as reactive as it once was, which is obviously a huge like win on a moral level for people that go through this stuff, right? Because oftentimes at the beginning it feels like it's never gonna it's never gonna get better, right? You just keep like reacting for no reason, but as time goes on, like once you see it getting calmer and calmer, it just like it keeps you more motivated, right? So that's really really important to keep in mind.
Yeah,
Okay, Dr. Firestone, we're slowly coming to an end here. We just passed our 1 hour. Can I ask you one more question, just
sure.
before we go? Okay. Yeah. So obviously, we spoke about many different strategies in this episode, right? So obviously, for the people that are watching, if you had to give them like one step that you might consider to be the most effective to use in the moment when you are going through a certain trigger, what would that actionable step be? Because most people just, they can only really keep one main message from an episode in their head. So if you had to give them, if possible, one actionable step, what would that be?
Take a deep breath.
Breathing, yeah.
Breathe. It's interesting that all ancient religious practices, including Christianity, Judaism, everything, not just Buddhism, really paid a lot of attention to breathing exercises because
Mm-hmm.
taking a deep breath and really filling your lungs and then really exhaling fully will calm you down. Then you can think, oh my gosh, what was that about? And start to write. And even if you
Yeah.
are not much of a writer, this is not about writing a novel. It's not about, in my case, spelling anything correctly, because that would take way too much thought. No,
Mm-hmm.
I have a dyslexia for that.
Oh, okay.
But just get it out there, right?
Uh-huh.
Get it out there. And then you can make sense of it later. You
Mm-hmm.
don't have to know everything about it. And just write anything that comes to mind. Let yourself think freely and just put anything down. It doesn't have to make sense. You can come back to it and try to make sense out of it. So it doesn't have to be this highly intellectual process. Just get it out there. But
Yeah.
first, calm yourself enough that you feel calm enough to do that. And that I would really suggest just breathing. Slow breaths. As fully inhale as you can and fully exhale. And just paying attention to that, because that's something you could do anywhere, right? You don't have to be, you don't have to wait until the end of the day when you're in a private situation. You can do it at work, at your desk. Nobody's going to notice. Just
Mm-hmm.
breathe. And,
And then like you'd say, mhm.
it'll calm you down.
God, and then you'd say the 478 model is the best to follow in your opinion, or
That's if
any
you
other
really want,
model?
if you're really upset, yeah, it's a good model to follow. But even just taking really deep breaths and
Okay.
and then blowing out. So if you're with somebody who's just had a trauma happen, and you're doing something called psychological first aid, what you
Mm-hmm.
do is the first thing is you try to get them to breathe with you. Like you wait till they take a big deep breath and you say, that was really good. And they kind of look at you like, what are you talking about? You go, you breathe, let's
Yeah.
breathe together.
Mm-hmm.
You can do this with a kid who's really upset. Hey, can you breathe with me? Let's just take some
Mm-hmm.
breaths.
Got it.
Anything, it just helps deactivate and calm down our nervous system.
100%. 100%.
If somebody's having an anxiety attack, it will help.
Mm-hmm.
And it may be that they just faced something that was terrifying, or they heard something that was traumatic, whatever. They went on social media and saw something that upset them.
Mm-hmm.
The things that happen,
Yeah.
right, in life nowadays. And
Yeah.
look at it, and then, take some breaths. Let's calm down. We're not getting chased by a lion. Our nervous system thinks we're getting chased by a lion, but we're not.
Mm-hmm.
We just, let's calm down here. And it really just sort of brings the whole thing down. And then we can look at it and we can get anything we can, even if it's just a couple words down on paper that we could look at later.
Mm-hmm. God. Okay. Well, that was a really, really good thing to obviously keep in mind, as you mentioned, to regulate the emotions. And hopefully, everything that we spoke about in this episode can definitely help people. Again, I really enjoyed this episode. Thank you so much. There's a bunch of information. I will also rewatch it and, take as many notes as I can from it. So thank you so much for this great episode, Dr. Firestone. But if people wanted to go and find your work, where would you tell them to go?
I would tell them to go to psycholive.org. That's our website. We have webinars, we have e-courses, we have blogs that they could read. And we have not just information for myself, but from lots of experts in the field. We have videos they could watch of some of the great meditation teachers like John Kabat-Zinn, Jack Kornfield, people, they could just take in some of our material. I think it would help them. So
Got it.
our website is about being alive to yourself, alive to your relationships, and alive to parenting. So, gets to all those levels.
Absolutely. Yeah. If you can send me that, in an email, I just will take all those links and I'll post it down below, and obviously people can go and check it out if need be. Okay, then.
Okay. Thanks. Sounds good.
Okay. Thank you so much, Dr. Firestone. I really enjoyed this, and I hope you have a wonderful day.
Thanks. You too. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much. Take
Bye-bye.
care.